Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, as we sit, the sequel to Top Gun, Maverick, starring Tom Cruise, by all accounts, is the highest-grossing film of all time, I think. And so, very, very topical. People are very much interested in fighter pilots and fighter planes. And the man we have on today might very well be described as a Canadian Maverick. Only unlike Tom Cruise, who's spent some time flying around in the F-14s, this man is a bona fide fighter pilot, and he's been involved in many different operations militarily for Canada, and his name is Tony Ledsham. And more than just a fighter pilot, he has been involved in some very, very interesting doings. There's a picture of him with the CF-18 in the background. And he's also, I understand, a crack shot. We get a picture of his award. There it is, the Top Gun. So we're happy to have Tony on the show today, and we're going to talk about his history, his military history, and his involvement with the Canadian Forces and the Air Force. But also, we're going to talk about some other things that have been happening that I think are very, very relevant to what's going on today in Canada, particularly in the political discourse. So before we get to him and introduce him fully, as we always do, we've got a few quotations. And in honor of our guest, these have a particular aviation theme. The first one is from someone who would be very well known to Tony. He's the man who was immortalized in a Hollywood movie some years ago, and this is Chuck Yeager, the credited with breaking the sound barrier. And he said something very interesting about being a pilot. He says, "There's no such thing as a natural born pilot. Whatever my aptitudes or talents, becoming a proficient pilot was hard work, really a lifetime's learning experience. For the best pilots, flying is an obsession, the one thing in life they must continually do. The best pilots fly more than others. That's why they are the best." The next one is from someone who never had the sensation of flying, but tried very hard to figure out how it could be done. This is a 16th century genius, Leonardo da Vinci, who was famously quoted as saying, "For once you have tasted flight, you will walk the earth with your eyes turned skywards, for there you have been, and there you will long to return." And finally, from a Russian authority, because of course we talk a lot about the MiGs. Aeronautics was neither an industry nor a science. It was a miracle, from Igor Sikorsky. So who do we have on the show today? Well, we have Tony Ledsham, and we met Tony in a very sort of unique way. He sent us an email. I want to read his email. He says, "I've listened to several of your podcasts. I have many stories you may be interested in. I lived in Cold Lake for 5 years, which is where I live. Flew the CF-18 in combat, and he discovered corruption at the Air Canada Pilots Association." And so Tony is a 20-year military officer, RCAF fighter pilot, as we said, multiple tours of combat, retired from the RCAF and was hired by Air Canada. And there he got involved with the pilots union, the ACPA, right to the top, where he was a master elected council, part of that council. And he's going to tell us about how he discovered corruption concerning the $8 billion pilots pension plan. And I understand that the pension plan for all of Air Canada is more than twice that. It's $20 billion. And he's also going to talk about how he was ostracized and eventually removed from the master elected council, and how the corruption extended all the way to the arbitrator who was involved in the situation. And he's also going to talk about some struggles he's had with his lawyer, although he assures me he is lawyer friendly, his son being a lawyer. And so here he is, Tony Ledsham. Welcome to Gray Matter, Tony. It's great to have you on the program.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Leighton. It's an honor to be here. And there's a famous joke about pilots, and it goes like this. It says, how do you know when a date with a pilot is half over? And that's when he says, enough about flying, let's talk about me. So I'll try and hit both of those, and
Yep.
maybe halfway through. I'll just tell you a bit of my background. So yeah,
Sure.
I joined the military in 1980. I went through pilot training right on to fighters. I started flying an airplane called the F-5, which was a beautifully political piece of work, that was jack of all trades, master of none. And they wanted to send us into combat against the Russians on the northern flank with that thing. And we used to call it the fighter by Mattel. It was absolutely horrible, but it was fun, and it looked like it was going 100 miles an hour just sitting on the ramp. So it was great for impressing women, and it looked great, but totally useless and totally political. Another one of those political acquisitions that the Canadian military is famous for. The F-18, on the other hand, was an enormous breath of fresh air. And when we first got that airplane, I joined it, I think about 2 years after we got the F-18, the initial batch. And it was like going from a Mini Cooper to a Ferrari. And fantastic airplane, got me through all kinds of very tough situations, and I loved it. It's way too old now. It needs to be replaced. But at the time, we were actually the king of the castle in the F-18s. So I went through training. I was initially assigned out to Bagotville in Quebec, flying the F-5. I met my first wife out there, lovely Saguenay girl, and we got married, had a couple of kids. Um, my second tour was in Cold Lake, so I went from being an F-5 pilot to an instructor pilot on the F-18, which was a big leap. You had to not only learn the airplane, but how to teach on it, and how to evaluate the student pilots coming through. And I spent almost 5 years there. And at that point, I thought I was going to a staff job. Typically, the rotation is 2 flying jobs and then a staff job. But I then got a exchange tour with the Royal Air Force. So I went over to England for 3 years. I flew the Tornado, and that was actually my first combat experience, was over Bosnia in the Tornado. I also went down to the Falkland Islands about 10 years after the conflict, and that was a real eye opener too. So the Royal Air Force, they're the real deal. I mean, they still deploy all over the world, not to the same scale as the USAF or the U.S. Navy, but for a country of its size, it's very impressive, and it was quite interesting to be involved with them for 3 years. And my son was born in England, so he's half Brit, half Canadian. Came back to Canada, did a couple of years in headquarters in North Bay, 600 feet underground, and then did my last tour, where I did my first tour in Bagotville, Quebec, and I flew the F-18 in combat over Kosovo. So that's the nutshell of my career in the military. I left the military in July of 2000, seeking calmer waters, as they say. It's, as you're probably aware, military life is tough on the family, especially. You're moving every 3 or 4 years. You have to change schools, change jobs, houses. So I thought, okay, well, I'll settle down and I'll go to Air Canada. And that was in July of 2000. Well, of course, September of 2001 was 9/11. And all of a sudden I found myself without a job again. So I found a job. I did that for a year, came back to Air Canada. And then I saw a few things that I wasn't happy with. So I thought, okay, well, I'll join the union and see if I can do anything from the, sort of from the inside and help things along. And I progressed up through the ranks of the union. I was on various committees, including the negotiating committee. And we went into arbitration in 2012. And it was final offer selection arbitration, which is particularly brutal. I think you're well aware of arbitration, aren't you, Leighton? But
Oh, yeah.
so we had our backs against the wall, and yeah, we got beaten up pretty bad. So I thought, okay, well, I'll stick with it, and I then was elected on the, as you said, the master elected council, and I got right to the top of the union. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna try and figure out some of these things, because these are injustices. You know, we made enormous concessions. Well, we were forced into concessions in 2012, but and most of it was due to the pension plan. You know, the pension was $4 billion underfunded, so it was underwater. So I started looking into the pension plan in that was about 2019, when I was on the master elected council, and I discovered some irregularities, I guess you could say. So I said, okay, well, I'll report this to the rest of the council. I think there were 11 pilots on the master elected council, and when I reported it to them, it was the standard deer in the headlights. You know, nobody bid on it, and I thought, oh. I'm the only guy in the room now that's on my side. So that started the battle. And 2.5 years later, I'm still fighting the battle.
Wow. That reminds me a little bit of an Al Pacino movie called Serpico. I want to go back a little bit to talk about your time in Cold Lake.
Yeah.
As you know, I've lived in Cold Lake here for over 20 years. I've had the pleasure of representing a lot of military people, including pilots.
Mm-hmm.
And the F-18 particularly is a very interesting story. And correct me if any of this is wrong, but it's my understanding that this aircraft came to Canada from the U.S. Navy in the early 1980s. And so at that time, they considered it was outdated. And I've actually represented a lot of the guys who take care of these aircraft, and it's quite remarkable what has to be done, like all the different checks and safety things and the maintenance of them. It's just incredible that you know, the amount of safety that goes into that airplane. And even so, I'm coming to my point here. Some years ago, back in 2003, a friend of mine who's a Hockey Hall of Famer, Grant Fuhr, he got to do a celebrity ride along, they called it. And I remember and so I spent the day with him when they were getting him ready. And the most memorable part of the day was we spent probably half a day learning about the ejector seat.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about? And this was absolutely horrifying because, of course, he had to be told before this was going to be fun. He thought he was like, you know, going for a ride in a Ferrari. But then you start going in, looking at the ejector seat and talking about all the things that could go really, really wrong.
Yeah.
And for the first time, you know, Grant is not somebody who's you know, faint of heart. I mean, he's a go-getter. But he looked at me like, he had this look on his eye like, do I really want to do this? Like, this could go really bad. And so I mentioned that to, you know, to come back to the amount of danger and risk that's involved just with training on the F-18. Could you talk about that a little bit, about how risky it is even just to learn how to fly one of these aircraft?
Yeah, so I'll go back to what you said earlier. So when we got the F-18, it was very much front line. So the U.S. Navy had only had it for a couple of years ahead of us. We'd actually had Canadian pilots on exchange with the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps before we received them in Canada. So it was very much at the front line. It was probably the best fighter available. That was one of the success stories of Canadian acquisition, and you probably don't remember the process in the late 70s to buy the F-18, but it was just like what we're going through with the F-35 right now. You know, there's lots of concern about the price and all that kind of stuff, but it did us very well. For the people who have been to Cold Lake, I highly suggest you go to the old headquarters building. There's a memorial across from the headquarters with the names of all the pilots and some navigators as well who've been killed in training accidents and even operational, not combat, but operational trips. And one of those was my best friend, a guy named Leif Erikson. So you can find his name on the wall too. He was a fisherman on the West Coast out of Vancouver. He was deployed out to Comox, and particularly nasty night out there. The winds were 70 knots on the surface. They couldn't. There was a fishing boat that was in distress off the west coast of Vancouver Island. They couldn't even fly the search and rescue airplanes. It was way outside their limits. So some bright spark said, well, let's deploy the F-18s. You know, they can do anything. So he and his wingman went out looking for this fishing boat. And as it turns out, the navigation system in his airplane was off by a little bit, and it was just enough for him to fly into a cliff on a very dark and nasty night. So that's one of the stories. Most of the fatal accidents we had in Cold Lake were a result of very aggressive training, and we had to do that. Back in those days, the threat was the Soviet Union. We had to fly low level, and when you're doing 500 or 600 miles an hour, 100 feet above the ground, it doesn't take much, to spear in. So I lost another good friend, and many colleagues doing that. The other issue, and your friend probably remembers, is the G suit that we wear. So this is a pair of trousers that you put on over your flying suit, and it fills up with air as you're pulling G. And the idea of that is to squeeze the blood back up into your head, because as you pull G, it drains the blood out of your head and you lose consciousness within a matter of seconds. So we've had instances where pilots have lost consciousness, even with the G suit. And once again, it doesn't take much to hit the ground if you're not flying the airplane. So the sort of mid to late 80s were a particularly hard time for the fighter force in Canada and all over the world, actually. Every force lost a lot of pilots, and they insisted on this low level ingress in order to avoid the Soviet radars, which we eventually found out was not a good idea, and stopped doing it in the late 90s, actually. And then the accident rate went way down. So as you said, it's a very demanding environment, but it's also a very, very fulfilling profession. And I would not hesitate to recommend it to anybody, who likes going fast and living fast as well. And that's really what it was about.
It really takes more than that, though, doesn't it? I recall there was a television series that was made about flight training school in Cold Lake. It was on about, I want to say, about 10, 15 years ago. And it was one thing that struck me was how young the pilots were and how rigorous that training was. It really, how would you put this? The people who aspire to be fighter pilots, it has to be much more than just that you want to go fast. You have to have a very, very strong belief in yourself in order to pilot one of those aircraft effectively, don't you? I mean, it's not for people who want to just sort of fool around and go fast. There's a certain personality trait that seems to be common to anyone who can effectively take on that aircraft. And these G forces, what you're talking about is sort of this Einsteinian concept of gravity that applies to people when you're going very fast. And my understanding of this, correct me if this is wrong, but each level of G force is equivalent to your own body weight pressing against you. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the limit on the F-18 was 7.5 G, and for a guy like me who's all dressed up, I weighed in about 200 pounds when I got into the airplane. So 7.5 G means my body now weighs 1,500 pounds. And when you're pulling 7.5 G, you cannot physically lift your arm. So in order to manipulate the radar and the weapon system, all the controls are on the throttle and the stick. It's called HOTAS, so hands-on throttle and stick. And that's the only way to do it. You cannot physically put your hand up onto the instrument panel to change a setting.
Incredible.
Now you don't pull 7.5 G all the time, but even at 5 G, it's a Herculean effort to do those kind of things.
Yeah, I've actually spent some time with some of these pilots, and incredibly dedicated people, and really wonderful members of the community, very, very involved, and I have to say, some very interesting people, interesting personalities. And one story I want to share about this, of course, you'll know about something called Maple Flag, which is sort of this annual military exercise. But I remember talking with some of the pilots out there, Canadian pilots, and maybe this was bravado, but they were telling me that it's their opinion that actually the Canadian pilots are perhaps the best of the bunch in terms of their ability to pilot an aircraft. Because, for example, in doing maneuvers with the American pilots, who have the sort of the newer, fancier, shinier models, the F-16s and so on. I just saw one of those actually at the air show here a couple weeks ago. Just incredible. But they were saying that because the aircraft, the F-18, is not as fast or as maneuverable as these other planes, that the Canadian pilots actually have to be better trained and more skilled in terms of their tactics, because they don't have as much, let's say, jam in the airplane. Would you agree with that, or is that a biased assessment?
No, that's typical fighter pilot bravado. So I've worked extensively with the U.S. Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps. I spent 3 years with the RAF, and there are absolutely incredible pilots all throughout, the Western world, and I'm sure with the Soviets as well. There's
Mhm.
or Russia now anyway.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, this is a survival instinct. You have to think that you're better than the other guy, and especially when you know that you're outgunned. So after I finished with the military, I'd been at Air Canada for, I guess, about 6 years, and then I had the opportunity to fly part-time with a company called Top Aces, and they
Oh
have
yes.
an office there in Cold Lake. So I got to fly
Mhm.
the Alpha Jet part-time, and the Alpha Jet is, it's nothing compared with the F-18, but the pilots that they hired were handpicked, and we were all very experienced F-18 pilots. So we knew the weaknesses of the F-18, which weren't very many, but there were ways that you could beat them. So most of the time they kicked our butts, but there were situations where they made mistakes, and you go, okay, I got you now. Yeah. So and that's not to say that we were better pilots, but we just had so much more experience. And like you said, you see how young these guys are. They're getting fewer flying hours now, so they're doing more in the simulator and fewer hours in the airplane, and there's just nothing to compare with being in that airplane and putting it through its paces.
So what was it? You grew up in Ontario, right? And so
Yeah.
what was it that drew you to flying these incredible machines? What was it? How did you first get involved in this, and what do you love about it?
Well, that's another funny story. So I'd always been very interested in airplanes, but my father was in the army in World War II, and he liked airplanes. We used to go to the air shows and stuff, but it wasn't a passion of his. Um, so I actually went out skiing in Banff. I think I was about 18, and we decided to kick in some big bucks and go heli skiing for a day. And of course, I thought this was just unbelievable. I was passionate about skiing. I thought, man, oh man, if I could fly in this helicopter and then just jump out every once in a while and go skiing, that would be great. So I thought I'd start flying helicopters. So I joined the military with the intent of flying helicopters, and I ran into a couple of jet pilots, and they said, "What are you thinking? Give your head a shake, dude." So they took me up in a T-33, which is a 1950s era jet, and I went, okay, I get it now. So I was hooked, and it's like you were saying earlier. It really is an addiction. Once you start doing this, flying jets, it is very addictive, and it's you feel the need for that adrenaline and that kickback from what you're doing.
Mhm. Speaking of adrenaline, I have to ask you about some of your experiences in action in Kosovo. So did you ever come into contact with the vaunted MiG of Top Gun fame, or what are some of the more memorable experiences you had, say in Kosovo, or some of the other military exercises you were involved in?
Yeah, I wish I had some wild stories about the MiG-28, but although the MiG-28, as you may not know, is actually an F-5 in the movie, which I flew. So,
Oh,
but no, I didn't have any air-to-air encounters, but we were shot at all the time from the ground. We had to drop bombs. We were dropping laser-guided bombs over there, and this is another one of these ridiculous things in the military that we thought they'd learned the lessons in Vietnam, but we came in the same route at the same time, night after night. and you could see the guns on the ground, as soon as they heard the noise, because we were flying with lights out, and they were suppressing the radars, but they just heard the jet noise and they started shooting at us. So I think it was the first night we went in, and I was the lead of 4 airplanes, and my number 4 couldn't find the target due to all of the smoke, from the previous bomb. So he was flying back out, back home with all his bombs on board, and that makes the airplane quite heavy and affects the maneuverability. And they started shooting from the ground, and they shoot tracer fire, so you can see the anti-aircraft artillery coming up. And he started maneuvering, but he started running out of airspeed very quickly. So he lit his afterburners, to try and get the airspeed back. And we were about 4 miles above the ground, and he was 8 miles behind me. And when he started screaming on the radio, I turned around in the cockpit and I looked back, and I could see his afterburners from 8 miles. So the people on the ground could see him very well. And as soon as he did that, he was fight center. They all turned the guns on him and started shooting. So,
Oh, no.
I just had to yell at him over the radio and say, "Get out afterburner. Take the airplane down, but don't advertise yourself." So that was one of the
Did he
wild
make it?
stories.
Did he make it
Oh yeah,
through?
yeah, he was fine. Yeah, and he didn't get hit, thankfully. Yeah. But there
Oh,
were,
great.
there was a stealth fighter that was shot down while we were there in Serbia, and that was a real shocker to us, because we all thought that the stealth fighter was invisible, to radar.
Hmm.
So they didn't have any jamming gear on board the airplane. They didn't even have a radar warning receiver to tell them that they were being lit up by radar, because, in typical egotistical fashion, the Americans thought, oh, well, nobody could ever see this thing, so why would the pilot want to know if they're seeing them? Well, they found him and they shot him down, and luckily they got the guy out before the sun came up in the morning, which was pretty incredible. They sent in a big package with helicopters and ground attack aircraft, and they got this guy back. And that movie, I think it was called Behind Enemy Lines.
Right.
When you watch that is just so ridiculously Hollywood, and the reality is much, much different. So if you do get shot down and you do get picked up, you're treated as an adversary. So if you're holding a pistol, they will point their guns at you and say, "Get down on the ground on your belly and throw your gun away," or they'll shoot you, because they think that you might have a bomb strapped to you, or you might, the enemy might have taken over your flying suit and be approaching you. So it's serious business. Yeah.
That conflict that you were in, Yugoslavian civil war, was very, very brutal, and it isn't talked, much like the Korean War. It isn't talked about very much. Do you have any ideas about why that is? I mean, we hear so much about Vietnam and some of the other conflicts, but that Yugoslavian conflict was very, very brutal. But it doesn't seem to get much parlance in terms of military history. You don't talk about it enough. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and that's a very topical question there, Leighton, because we see what's going on in Ukraine right now, and there's a lot of rhetoric from the West, and from NATO saying, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, but of course they're not willing to do anything militarily, because Putin has said he's going to press the big nuclear button. But Kosovo and Bosnia are not NATO signatories, yet NATO fully participated in liberating them, so to speak, from the Serbs. So it's a very political issue, and I don't think you'll ever see a lot of talk about it until they reform NATO.
Interesting.
It's so hypocritical right now with what's going on in Ukraine, and you think, well, we're trying to coax Ukraine to coming to NATO, so why wouldn't we go and defend them when we jumped into Kosovo and Serbia?
What type of support is the Canadian military providing in that war at the moment, if any, in Ukraine? We don't, obviously this is not this is being largely kept from us in the news. We know there's money going over there, but are there actually Canadian military deployed in that conflict right now? Do you know?
No, not officially, as far as I know. So there were military advisors up until the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, they were helping the Ukrainian forces, in training, but they pulled them all out. We've given them some artillery and some shells and lots of money, but I mean, who knows? There could be JTF2 guys over there, special forces, but I'd be surprised because the Russians really do dominate most of the country there right now. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, sorry for the deep dive into your military background, but it is very, very interesting to me. I'm sure to the people listening. So let's talk about your experiences in Air Canada. So here you're a jet pilot. You're fighting one enemy, an enemy that you were trained to fight, and then you get into what was supposed to be sort of calm, serene civilian life, and then you find out that you're up against this other unseen, surreptitious but very dangerous enemy called administrative, bureaucratic corruption. So tell us about that. How did you uncover? How did you come down to cover this corruption? How did it come to your attention when you were involved on the council?
Yeah, so like I was saying, I was involved in the negotiating committee, and our contract. I can't remember how many pages it was. It was probably 270 pages, so it was incredibly complex and detailed. We had to get fully up to speed in all this, and what brought the arbitration to a head was the deficit that we had in our pension plan. So the company said, "Hey, we can't continue like this." They would have had to pay $800 million a year into the pension plan under the pension funding rules, the federal funding rules. So we said, yeah, we get that, we get that. So we're going to help you out because we don't want the company to fold. So we participated and as did all of the other unions, the flight attendants and the rampies and the mechanics and everything else. So we cooperated with the company, and we got to dive into the books a little bit. We had to sign non-disclosure agreements, and then we found out that the only thing they told us you could find out on the interweb. So, but anyway, we got very smart very quickly about things like the pension plan and the finances of the company. So that was 2012. 2 years later, the pension deficit had gone from a $4 billion deficit to I think it was about $1 billion surplus. And a year after that, it was so high that the company was disallowed from making contributions into the pension plan. So the employees still had to contribute to the pension plan, but the company was not allowed to because they were afraid it would be a tax evasion if the company did it. So at this point, I'm thinking, well, maybe it's time that the company gave us a little bit back, at least on the pension. We won't go after wages and working conditions, but at least on the pension, just loosen the purse strings a bit and then give us something back that we lost in 2012. And that's when they started digging a bit deeper into the pension. And one of the issues was the management of this pension had been done by a very brilliant individual who was an employee of Air Canada. So he and his team, his name was Jean-Michel, and he and his team worked in the headquarters of Air Canada, and they set up absolutely awe-inspiring method of investment and what's called bond overlays. So these are protective measures so that you don't lose the assets in the pension. So as you know, pension investments, you have to be very careful with them. You don't want to be out speculating on cryptocurrency and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So he did a fantastic job, set it all up, and then he left, for greener pastures. And the company then started a wholly owned subsidiary called TransCanada Capital. So they set up this subsidiary, and I think you can still find them on the internet. And their job was to now manage the $20 billion in assets. So I asked the chair of the pension committee, I said, how much do these guys get paid? And he said, it's very modest. It's 0.2%. So I said, well, that's $40 million a year. He goes, no. He said, 20 billion is 9 zeros. You're doing the math wrong. I said, no, actually it's 10 zeros. So this team of people, I think there's probably about 8 people that show on the books, and I'd never heard of any of them. I think they were probably just hired for a photo op. They're being paid $40 million a year to do this, and it's a wholly owned subsidiary. So guess what? the money is being paid out of the pension plan and it's going right back into the coffers of Air Canada. So this is just one of the things that I found out. And when I started rattling the cages, that's when they clamped down on me.
How did the pension go so dramatically from a deficit to such a large surplus? How was that accomplished? Do you have any idea?
Well, and then it is possible because of the interest rates. So the interest rates were exceedingly low back then, and that has an enormous effect on pension assets, when the interest rates are low, because they rely on bonds and things like that. Beyond that, I really don't know, because the company's not stupid. If they're cooking the books other than that, they're going to hide it very well.
So the essence of,
it was plausible that it went from 4 billion, because 4 billion out of 20 is what, 20%. So
right. So the essence of the corruption there was that they were paying a wholly owned subsidiary out of the proceeds from the pension to provide an ostensible service. That was the idea, or?
Well, but there's nothing illegal about doing that. The corruption was the fact that the union was trying to hide what was going on, and they were unwilling to, go back to the company and say, hey, listen, we need to get something back here because you're really, really profiting from, from our concessions. So why these individuals were doing it, and if there was any money changing hands, once again, it's that's why I was hoping to get the courts involved and get them to do a forensic audit of the union to find out if there was money coming in the back door for union members and that kind of stuff. But I got shut down completely.
Well, given what has come out in the media recently about a certain union leader who took a $50,000 a bribe, it would seem to be that there's probably some fire where the smoke is. But what happened to you in the aftermath of this was very interesting, and that is that essentially when you pointed this out, and as you said, you got all the blank stares. All of a sudden, you were persona non grata on that council, right? Talk about that, about how you were treated in the aftermath of bringing this corruption to the attention of people who you thought would be very interested to know about it.
Yeah, so the first step was there was a workplace harassment complaint brought against me by the senior lawyer at ACPA, a guy named Brad Ridge. So he filed this workplace harassment complaint. They assigned an arbitrator to deal with it, and I was in communication with the arbitrator, and he was quite open. So I thought, okay, well, this guy's going to listen to my side of the story. And then all of a sudden, he was no longer available. So that was wiped off the table. So they set up another arbitrator after that, and I thought, okay, well, this isn't going to go away. This is serious business. So that's when I hired a lawyer, and I thought I'm going to get a good lawyer. So I went to Hennon Hutchison LLP in Toronto, the infamous Marie Hennon and her company, and I thought, she had not only defended Jan Ghomeshi, but she had also defended Admiral Mark Norman. And she did a good job with Mark Norman. So I thought, okay, well, she's going to understand the military ethos, and hopefully she'll believe me when I say my story, because a lot of it comes down to who you believe, in two sides of the story. And so their company assigned me to a guy named Alex Smith. So I looked him up on their website, and he did have experience with pensions. So I thought, okay, well, he's going to get it. He also had a PhD in English literature from Columbia University in New York, and a Master of Arts from Cambridge University in England. So I thought, wow, this guy's going to be a rock star. He's very sharp. So COVID had just hit, and there were no in-person interviews. So we did a telephone interview for the first one. And as soon as he started speaking, I went, holy crap, like, there's no way this guy's got a PhD in English literature. I expected him to speak like Shakespeare, and he was just a regular guy. So I said, hey, Alex, do you mind if we go on video? We'll go on FaceTime. He goes, yeah, sure, whatever. So sure enough, it was the guy that was in the picture. I thought, my God, like what happened here? So we had a couple of emails back and forth, and there were grammar errors and spelling errors. And I thought, what the heck is going on? So I called up Columbia University, and I said, I went to the registrar's office first, and I said, do you have a PhD on file for Alex Smith? They said, oh, well, we can't tell you, to do private issues. And I said, well, he's actually my employee. I've got him under retainer, so I need to know. Oh, no, we can't tell you. We can't tell you. So then I called the library and I said, do you have a dissertation on file from Alex Smith in 2006?
Clever.
And the librarian goes, well, you know what? No, we don't. And I said, well, is that normal? And she goes, well, no, it's impossible. There's no way that somebody could have a PhD without having a dissertation on file.
Wow.
So I thought, holy cats. So I called up Cambridge in the UK and I said, do you have a thesis on file for Alex Smith? They said, oh, well, we can't tell you due to privacy issues and all that kind of stuff. So I wasn't getting anywhere on the phone, so I sent some emails back and forth. And then finally, the registrar's office sent me an email that was cryptically written, but she had highlighted the key issues there. And it said, you're not eligible for a Master of Arts at Cambridge unless you've done your bachelor's there, because it's a concurrent program. So you have to do the bachelor's, which flows right into the master's. Well,
Right.
He'd done his bachelor's at U of T. And it turns out it was the same thing at Columbia. You don't do your PhD at Columbia unless you've done your master's at Columbia.
Yeah.
So not only had he not got the degrees, he didn't even qualify for entry into either of them. And I think if you go on the website, it still says that he's got a PhD and a master's. Like the arrogance of these guys is just unbelievable.
Did you confront him with this information?
Oh yeah, well that's another funny story. So, things are starting to go bad, and I hate to say this because I know you're a lawyer, but in typical lawyer fashion,
It's okay. I've heard a lot of really
you got a thick skin too, right?
And lawyer jokes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's a few of those. But anyway, he was, and I'd seen this before, right back from a divorce and that kind of stuff. So when lawyers don't want to participate anymore, they stop communicating with you, and they just run up the bill based on emails and phone calls, and they don't actually produce. So I saw the same thing.
Bad lawyers do that. Yes.
Yeah, bad lawyers. Sorry. So I saw the same behavior by this guy, and I knew at that point that he was corrupt, and he knew the lawyer for the opposing he knew the opposing counsel from working at Tories. They were both at the same company, and I figured that they were conspiring against me. There was nothing happening for what he was. He billed me $25,000.
Wow.
So we ended up having a Zoom meeting with him and I can't remember his first name, Hutchison. I think it's Scott Hutchison, which is the name partner from Hennon Hutchison. Mm-hmm. And Hutchison came across as, your arrogant prick. And, he starts lecturing me about how dare I question Alex's, performance and educational criteria. And I said, Mr. Hutchison, I said, when you hired Alex, did you do your due diligence? Did you actually look into what he's saying? So, oh, how dare you question that? Are you actually saying that he doesn't have his PhD? And I said, no, I'm not saying that. But I said, you should actually look into it. It's not hard. So we finished the phone call, and I sent them all an email, and I said, in order to settle this matter in a non-acrimonious fashion, just send me back my $25,000 and I'll drop the issue. Well, Hutchison, instead of forwarding my email to the other three parties that were named, he hit reply all. So I get a copy of his reply back, and he goes, okay, let's go radio silence on this. And he goes, Marie, did you actually finish your master's at Columbia? Because she'd done her master in laws at Columbia as well. Well, of course, I phone up Columbia, and they don't have a thesis on file for her in the law department either. So I wouldn't be surprised if she's a fraud as well.
Well, I really hate hearing stories like that because, speaking as a lawyer, of course, I don't speak on behalf of the profession, but the lawyers that I know who are good at what they do and they care about what they do, we all understand that we are service providers, and the client is the boss. The client is the profession of law should be a client-based exercise, and so it really troubles me to hear stories like that. I don't doubt what you say, but it certainly is troubling to hear that. And so, but coming back to the relationship with the lawyer, what exactly did you hire them to do?
So I knew that I was in big trouble with the union because they weren't going to back down. So they wanted me not only off the Master Elected Council, but they wanted me kicked out of the union as well. We had two pilot forums, on the internet. One was dedicated to Air Canada pilots, and the other one is professional pilots in Canada. And I got kicked off both of those forums, undoubtedly due to pressure from ACPA. So I couldn't, I lost my audience at that point. And they kept ramping it up. So eventually we went to arbitration, and the arbitrator, a guy named Matthew Wilson, I knew right off the bat that this guy was crooked. Like he was not interested in hearing what I had to say. And it was during COVID, so it was all Zoom meetings. So I would start speaking, he would just mute me. And, when he asked me a question, I would start speaking, then he'd mute me again. And, his decision was copied and pasted from what ACPA was looking for. So then it quietened down after that. And I thought, oh, well, I'm sick and tired of fighting this, and I really don't care anymore. Well, then they took me to court on an urgent basis. So I had less than a month to prepare. I'd given up on trying to find a lawyer to represent me. So they took me to the Superior Court of Ontario last November. And this was to endorse the decision of this arbitrator. And the judge at this court hearing, and this was actually one of the first in-person hearings they'd had. It was just after, when did this happen? I think this was in March or April of this year. And so we did an in-person hearing, which I was quite happy to do. And the judge, she was ineffective at running her court. So it wasn't just her decision, but she was ineffective of actually running the court. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The clock on the wall was broken, and she kept referring to the clock, and it was like 8 hours out. So finally, the opposing counsel said, well, Your Honor, there's a clock at the bottom of your computer screen. And she goes, oh, okay. But she kept looking up at the clock. I don't know what the bailiff is actually supposed to do, but he kept getting up and walking out of the court. He wouldn't ask for permission to leave or any of that kind of stuff. He'd just walk out. She spent most of the time with the opposing counsel talking about how the papers were filed with me. So I put my hand up and I said, Your Honor, I'm not contesting the service of the documents. And she said, no, it's not your turn to talk. So she spent another 45 minutes talking to this guy. And then she gets to me, and she did, it was obvious she didn't really want to hear my side of the story. So I thought, okay, well, there's no way that she could endorse that decision. The evidence that they presented was, I think it was about, I think it was about 700 pages of evidence that the opposing counsel had put into this case. And I said to her, this is all hearsay and rumor. There is no support for this evidence that the opposing counsel has presented. But in the end, in her decision, she said, well, it's not about that. There's no reason for me not to endorse it. So there was nothing that said she couldn't endorse it. But from my point of view, how could you endorse a decision which was so obviously wrong and crooked? So I filed for an appeal right away. And initially said, oh, no, you can't file in the Court of Appeal. It has to go to the divisional court, which I don't know if you have that in Alberta, but it's like a lower court to the Court of Appeal. So I said to them, well, no, the divisional court can't rule on a superior court ruling. And they said, oh, no, it's, because of the way it was organized and stuff. So they sent it to the divisional court, and the judge from the divisional court comes back and goes, no, we can't rule on a superior court ruling. It's like, well, that's what I was trying to tell them. So it goes back to the Court of Appeal, and they came up, I don't know if it's a purely Ontario thing, but it's called, I think it's called Rule 2.1, which is a vexatious and frivolous application. You probably have a similar thing in Alberta, but so they said, oh, no, this is a vexatious and frivolous application. We're kicking it out and you have no recourse. And that's the battle I'm in right now. I'm still trying to get my appeal back into court.
So what is the issue that you want the court to deal with on appeal?
Well, I want them to not endorse the decision of the arbitrator. And as soon as they do that, that means that all of the charter rights that have been taken away from me. I mean, the decision from the arbitrator was unbelievable. Like I wasn't allowed to approach any of these people. I wasn't allowed to call them. I wasn't allowed to email them. It just went on and on. I said, this is ridiculous. Like I don't present a threat to these people. So why am I being subjected to all these things? So I wanted them, first of all, to turn that down. Now I'm also suing ACPA, the Air Canada Pilots Association, in civil court. I'm actually taking them to small claims court. So, and they're well aware of that. Like they said, okay, well, if you drop your court case, then we'll drop the damages that the court awarded. And I said, yeah, well, good luck with that.
You weren't willing to accept that quid pro quo.
No.
And is it also true to say that you brought a claim against your lawyer for negligent representation? And how's that going?
Yeah, so we had the case conference a couple of weeks ago, and he was actually present. I was surprised because he'd hired, well, their firm had hired another company to represent him. So there we've got a pretty prominent lawyer and another law firm which is pretty prominent in small claims court going against someone who's self-represented. So that was a pretty interesting experience. So there was no surprise. He wasn't willing to even contemplate negotiating. They're just going to go to court.
Well, they seem to have miscalculated. They don't realize that somebody who flies around strapped to a rocket getting shot at over Kosovo is not really frightened by lawyers and judges and labor arbitrators.
Well, and I mean that's a great story, but well, first of all, if there's any negotiations, and I said this to him, I said, I'm not surprised at your intransigence, because if you were to negotiate a settlement, that would be a de facto admission of guilt. Mm-hmm. So I knew they weren't going to go there, and they knew that they weren't going to go there too. Yeah.
So while I have you here, I have to take the opportunity to talk to you about what's been happening to the military in Canada, particularly in terms of vaccine mandates. You obviously have a lifetime of service, a decorated officer, and I'll be honest, I have a vested interest here because, as you know, I represent many workers, not military people, but, for example, large group of WestJet people. And here's the scenario that I'm seeing, and I'm interested in getting your thoughts on this because of your, the allegations that you've brought against the unions and management. What we've been seeing in our practice almost invariably is something that looks like this, talking about vaccine mandates. So, a company like WestJet has a vaccine mandate. They impose that on everyone. They don't seek the input of the workers. And so effectively what it amounts to the workers is they lose their jobs. There's an involuntary unpaid leave of absence if they refuse to take this experimental drug. And many people refused, and others took it, not realizing the risks, because, of course, no one can provide informed consent to taking of these drugs. We don't know the short and long-term consequences. But it gets worse. So when these poor people go to their union for help, and they say, well, I want to grieve this. It's essentially the loss of my job over a medical decision. The union pulls out a ready legal opinion from firm X. But I've seen a number of these opinions, and they could be from firm X, firm Y, firm Z, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Whatever firm it comes from, it all says the same thing. Well, we're not going to advance your grievance because our expert lawyers have told us that the policy is fine, and if we grieve this, we're just going to lose. And really, this is how I've come into the equation. And so what it looks like from where I sit, and certainly from my client's point of view, is that there is some degree of cooperation, perhaps collusion, between management and the union. And as I listen to your story, Tony, wow, this seems to add up. What do you think? Do you think that is conspiracy theory stuff, or do you think that there really is a possibility that these unions are in collusion with management and the Canadian government to force people to take these vaccines?
Well, so from my perspective at ACPA, I am absolutely convinced that the union, the Pilots Association, is colluding with the company. There are other unions at Air Canada who are much more militant. The Rampies are probably the best example of that. So in that case, it's oops, sorry, my camera's slipping here in the heat. The chances of collusion, I think, are lower, but there's also pressure from the company too, and from the government, obviously. The lawyers, as you say, there's this sort of cookie cutter response. And a sidebar here, I've been on disability insurance for the last 2 years, just over 2.5 years, and I had huge battles with Canada Life. They actually kicked me off twice, and they said, no, you're gone. And I said, well, no, you can't just do that. There's a process to actually terminate somebody's insurance. No, you're gone. We're not paying you anymore. So I went back to the union, even though they weren't really speaking to me. And to my surprise, they actually said that they would file a grievance. So, we went to a lawyer who I knew from negotiations, and he seemed to be a reasonable guy. Then he was cooperating for a while. And then eventually said, no, the union has said that your chances of winning are not good, so we're not going to proceed with the grievance. So I said, yeah, but you're the guy that's providing the advice to the union. What do you think? And he goes, no, I agree. So when you get into that, there's really not much you can do. But these grievances, you deal with the Labor Relations Board, and I've had many dealings with them before too, and that's another minefield. It's just. You can't, and it's, I think you get it. It's so sad that we have these institutions that are really there to protect individuals. They're not there to protect companies or unions. They're supposed to be protecting the citizens. And it's obvious that they're not doing that, and so where do you go? Like, do we really have to go to the Supreme Court with all these things? That can take years, right?
It's a great question, Tony, that you put your finger on, because as you say, these trade unions, sadly, I don't want to paint them all with the same brush, but a lot of them are really letting workers down. And worse than that, because of the terms of the CBA and the way that labor law is set up in the various provinces, there's nowhere to go. And in fact, what our firm has done is we brought claims against governments and employers over human rights violations. And now what we're getting applications from their lawyers saying, well, you can't do this. You're doing indirectly what you can't do directly, because only the union can sue us. And this is a very live question. We've launched some lawsuits on behalf of these groups that are somewhat experimental, but we're trying to find a soft part of the animal so that we can at least get in front of a judge so that we can get something adjudicated, because these poor workers, they're all just basically told that by their unions, no, we're not going to do the job that we said we were going to do. We were contracted to do under the CBAs, and so it's a very, very frustrating. And the military are another example. You probably saw there was a recent decision that actually went in favor of some military people over vaccine mandates, but it's a very, very difficult situation that's going, and we're seeing this erosion, as you said in your case, of the rights of individuals, and we don't have labor arbitrators or courts who are ready to stand up for workers in this sense. Hopefully, things are changing. There are signs. There are some encouraging signs, but as we sit right now, it's very, very discouraging for workers, because it seems that they're cut off at every turn. It's almost like a loaded game in dealing with their unions and with the employers, and especially with the government of Canada.
Yeah. So two things there on the union side. ACPA actually shot themselves in their foot by kicking me out of the union, because now I'm no longer subject to the Constitution. And the Constitution says, A, you cannot appeal an arbitrator decision, and B, you cannot sue the union. Well, now that I'm not subject to the Constitution, I'm now appealing the decision and suing the union. On the military side, it's very interesting because when we deployed over the years, even for exercises, depending on where you're going, you're subject to all these different vaccines. So I've got yellow books that are full of vaccinations, and you had to keep them up, before you left, even if there was very little threat of getting yellow fever in, wherever we were going, but you had to get all these vaccinations. So I never had any adverse reactions, so I trusted the system. And even when the COVID vaccines came out, I read about them, the mRNA technology, and I thought, wow, this is a real game changer, because it has enormous potential benefits in treating other issues, even like cancer and stuff. So mRNA can be very, very good, but when they brought it in under the emergency use authorization, the first warning flag was that the vaccine companies, the producers, were isolated from indemnification. So they could do whatever they wanted without worrying about being sued. And then, then the reports started coming out about the side effects and how it was obviously being covered up. And that's when I went, because I actually got both doses of the vaccine. And I was pressured just a couple of months ago to get a third boost, because I was going on a cruise in Europe, and they said, well, you had to have had your last dose within 270 days. So I called up the cruise company. I said, they're in a hope and heck, like I'm either off the cruise or you got to find a way out. And they found a way out, but there's no way that I would get the booster now.
So you're still employed by Air Canada, though, aren't you?
Well, and that's the great thing. It's another loophole in our contract. So it says when you're off on disability leave, they're not allowed to fire you. And I actually, I booked off as disabled just before COVID hit, so they couldn't link it to COVID. And so there's a few other guys who booked off after COVID hit when they announced this mandatory vaccine policy, and then the company was all over them, of course, because they thought that they were using this loophole in the contract to avoid being terminated.
So, what's the future for you, Tony? What are you going to continue to fight this appeal, to fight these legal battles? And if so, what is your end game? What do you hope to accomplish? Obviously, more than just personal satisfaction. I get the sense that you've got a broader perspective. You're doing this on behalf of a larger group of people. That's how you're motivated. For you? What's the end game? How would you like all this to turn out in the end, if in a perfect world?
Well, I've had various court hearings and case conferences, and a lot of times in small claims court, they'll get down to the money, and they'll say, well, it's unrealistic to expect that you get $35,000 from this. And with the one with Alex Smith, the lawyer, I said, well, what would you be willing to offer, Mr. Smith? And he goes, well, maybe $2,500. So I said, oh, okay. So you are, sort of admitting there might be some liability on your part. And then he backed off, and I said, hey, I'll take $1. I will accept $1. And he said, well, there's going to have to be I don't know what they call it, a non-disclosure agreement where you can't talk about it. And I said, oh, no. I said, no, I'm not going to entertain that idea whatsoever. So what I'm interested in is justice, and like I said, my son's a lawyer, and you get it, right? Like, if there are bad lawyers out there, they need to be disbarred. They cannot, because we have to trust the lawyers and the judges. We can't keep doing this. It's ridiculous. And he wasn't the only one. I can't even remember her name now. There's a famous, infamous labor lawyer in Toronto, Howard Levitz. So I got involved with them before Alex Smith, and I realized that I was getting the runaround from them too. So yeah, I've had some unfortunate interactions with lawyers, and really what I want to do here is stop this injustice and get these crooks recognized. Because, I mean, fraud is a serious issue. When you're in a position of responsibility, I think they should go to jail. I think they should do some prison time for this. This isn't just a fine and public service. They need to go into jail and have a good hard think about what they're doing. Get off social media and look at three walls and a bunch of bars.
So we've been talking about Air Canada and some of the corruption there in terms of the union. Do you see the sort of the hand of the federal government in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I got in when COVID started. I was still actually on the master elected council, even though that they were attacking me, but they hadn't succeeded in kicking me off. So we got into the government bailouts to all these companies, and the one that we used as pilots was the CEWS, and there was a lot of money on the table there. So when you looked at the government website, it said this money will be paid to the employer, but the idea of it is to augment the employees' wages who had been adversely affected by COVID. So pilots are paid based on flying hours. It's not a salary. It's an hourly wage, and our flying hours have been cut from approximately 80 hours a month down to 55 hours a month. So it was an enormous hit to income. So I said, well, it says right here on the website that it's supposed to augment this cut in salary. But of course, we didn't get any of that money. The company just pocketed it all. And I brought it up with the union, and I knew at that time it was I was just wasting oxygen by bringing it up. But I brought it up with the company too, and they got quite upset that I was talking directly to them and not through my union. So I said, "No, my union's useless."
Well, the Liberal government has not been a friend to either Air Canada or the military. So it seems that you're
when you say not a friend to Air Canada, they haven't been a friend to the employees, but they now own a 6% stake of Air Canada, so they very much have their fingers in the pot.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Was not.
Okay, yeah, I get you.
Yeah. Okay, so this has been a really, really interesting conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. However, I would be remiss, and I'm sure many people are wondering, I haven't asked you the question. How did you get the nickname Bones? We've got to hear the story.
Well, that one's actually kind of boring, but because my real name is Anthony, but I've gone by Tony ever since I was a kid. So when we were going through flying training, the guys started singing Tony Maroney and all that kind of stuff, and one of them started calling me Boney. So I ended up with the call sign Boney, which was it was awful. So I managed the first squadron I went on. I said, yeah, they used to call me Boney, but I think Bones would be more appropriate. So I managed to pick up Bones. And then on my last tour in the Air Force, the squadron commander, his call sign was Bones, and you can't have two guys on the squadron with the same call sign. So then I had to go to my backup, which was Zeke. Yeah, and that's what my dad used to call me when I was a little kid. I don't know why, but anyway.
This call sign
it's a pretty boring story compared with a lot of guys. I'm sure you've heard some pretty good ones, but
this call sign is a big deal for you guys, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and we used to use it on the radio. So if you were flying along and you saw an airplane settling in the six of somebody else, you'd say, "Hey, Bones, break right," and they finally got away from that because there's too much confusion. So it really is a symbolic thing now. It's not a tactical issue. But,
okay.
That show that you were talking about, I can't remember what it was called, about the pilot training in Cold Lake, but one of the episodes was dedicated to the the call sign assignment process at 410 Squadron, the training squadron on the F-18, and it was hilarious, and some of them were pretty racy, and there was a guy that was going through, and his last name was Jobin, so he was a francophone, and it's spelled Jobin. Well, of course, the Anglophones would call it Jobbin. So his call sign was Blow, as in Blow Jobbin. And as far as I know, he's still got it. I think he's either a lieutenant colonel or a full colonel. He's still Blow Jobbin. Now try explaining that to the Americans, when you go down there. It's like,
so much for Gray Matter being a family show.
Yeah, sorry, I just blew it. Oh, that was another pun.
All right, so this is a part of the program called the reading list. So we try and point people to some other resources where they can learn more about you and what you're doing and aviation and things like that. So before I give my recommendations, is there anywhere where people can go to find more about you and what you're doing? Do you have a website or anything like that where you
No, I haven't. I've been representing myself, so I'm maxed out just doing my own battles. I don't have time for that.
Yeah,
But
sounds like
in terms of resources, the one that I'm using these days is it's called the Fighter Pilot Group on LinkedIn, and
okay.
it's international. There's Europeans and Americans and Canadians on it. It's very good. There's some great stories on there. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I got a couple of books. One is called, and you might be familiar with these. One is called Fall of an Arrow by an author named Murray Pedden. And this tells the story of course, the Avro Arrow. And we had another guest on the show previously, Bernie Robitaille, whose father was very, very involved in the Arrow project. And so the description of this book is on February 20th, 1959. February 20th is my birthday, by the way, for anybody who's interested.
1959?
No, not 59. John Diefenbaker announced to the House of Commons the cancellation of the CF-105 Arrow. Its development costs at that time were $340 million. I don't know what that would be in Trudeau dollars, probably $340 billion. The Arrow was to be the world's unsurpassed interceptor aircraft, yet within 2 months of the Prime Minister's announcement, 6 completed aircraft were dismantled and all papers and documents associated with the project were destroyed. And so this book tells the history and development of the Arrow, the plane that would have made Canada the leader in supersonic flight technology. The Arrow was designed to fly at twice the speed of sound and carry the most advanced missile weapon system. That's incredible, in 1959. So it tells the story of the men and women who were in the vanguard of the new technology, who had come from England, Poland, and the United States to make aviation history. I chose that book because it has not only the aviation aspect, but also, this sort of specter of political corruption, because, we really don't know fully. Some people do, but the public really doesn't know what happened with the Arrow project. So I thought that one might be of interest. And also, it's a piece of Canadian history. The second book I have is sort of has a aviation angle. It's called Mozart's Brain and the Fighter Pilot: Unleashing Your Brain's Potential. And this was from an eminent neuropsychiatrist and best-selling author named Richard Restek, who's an MD. So he combines the latest research in neurology and psychology to show us how to get our brain up to speed for managing every aspect of our busy lives, and everything from physical exercise. And he says here, few people think of the brain as being susceptible to change in its actual structure, but in fact, we can pre-select the kind of brain we will have by continually exposing ourselves to rich and varied life experiences. And of course, our guest today is a great example of the truth of that. So those are the books that I would recommend. Do you have any that you would recommend, Bones?
Oh, well, I'm a big fan of military history and especially on the aviation side. And I've just finished a book about Thunderbolt pilots in World War II, and the book was written by this gentleman's daughter, as is often the case these days. So that's a great one. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't spout out the names. And another one that I just finished reading was also written by this individual's daughter, and his name was Robin Olds, and he was I think one of the only aces in the Vietnam War, but he'd also gone through World War II. He was also a World War II pilot. So a shout out to the daughters out there. So many of these stories die with these individuals, and these daughters not only went through the sort of diaries and the notes that these individuals had kept, but they were fortunate enough to be able to talk to these guys before they passed away and put it into a readable format. So, So I'm sorry I can't be more
That's okay.
specific, but I would like to get back to the Arrow if you got a second.
Sure,
there.
absolutely. Yeah.
So, there are a lot of issues with the Arrow and the the final knife was the cost of it, and there's no doubt that it had ballooned way out of control. But what Canada was expecting to do was to sell it to our allies, and the Americans dug their heels in and said, manned interceptors are finished. We're gonna develop missiles instead of fighter aircraft, and that's how Canada ended up with the Beaumark missile. And a lot of people don't realize it, but the Beaumark missile had nuclear warheads in it. So this is pretty dangerous stuff. Well, and so do many of the air-to-air missiles that we ended up carrying. I don't think the Arrow was designed to carry nuclear-equipped missiles, but it was fantastic technology, and especially considering our background, because we hadn't developed that many aircraft in the past. We built them under license, the Spitfires and especially the Lancaster bombers. So we had lots of experience in production of military aircraft, but not so much in the design. But they did bring in a very, very good team. And my mother's cousin was married to one of the engineers who worked on the Arrow here in Malton in Toronto. And when they shut down the program, he moved down to the States, and he was one of the guys that ended up working indirectly for NASA, in the space program. So a lot of these guys ended up in the NASA space program.
Yeah, and what an incredible brain drain that was for Canada. Speaking of the missile, there's a Cold Lake connection there, because rather controversially, it was tested up here in the big bombing range, or in the early 80s. Yeah. So a lot of people were very nervous about that.
No, you're talking about the cruise missile there.
Yes.
Yeah. No, the Beaumark was a surface-to-air missile. It was designed to shoot down the bombers. Instead of sending up fighters, they were just going to shoot these things down up over the Arctic, where nobody cared, right? But the cruise missile, I got involved in the cruise missile testing, and that was a funny story there too. So we had, I don't know if you were around during those days, but we had a lot of protesters, and they ended up chaining themselves across the access road to the bombing range in Cold Lake. So the fighter pilots were all kind of gathered around at the bar, and we're talking about this, and so we said, hey, we could fill up the fire bucket with a bunch of honey and drop it on these guys who are chained across the road, and see how long they survive with the mosquitoes.
This is what fighter pilots talk about. Okay.
Yeah. It's thinking outside the box, right?
So one last thing I want to ask you about.
Yeah.
And that is, this is a touchy subject, but I often wonder, when I think of people like yourself who risked so much, even just to go through training to become a fighter pilot in all branches of the military service. And I think about the generations of soldiers who fought in the Great War and the Second World War and the Korean conflict and all the other ones, where people have gone into very, very dangerous situations, risked their life for a flag, for a country, for family. And I often think about, what would these people be thinking now when they look at the reflection of the country that they risked their lives for? I mean, think of World War II. That war. The rallying cry was freedom. We were fighting against evil. We were fighting these fascist dictators who wanted to take over the world. And here today, from within our own country, our own government is fashioning our country into an authoritarian dictatorship. This must really, really bother people like you at a deep, deep level.
Absolutely. And I can't even begin to tell you how discouraged, disappointed, and upset I am at the direction that I see things going. I mean, I don't know if you saw the latest missive about the dress regulations, but basically you can have male soldiers with rainbow colored hair wearing skirts on parade now. And it's like, there's a great article by a Marine Corps general, and he said the military was never designed to reflect social values. The military has to be tough, and they have to be violent, and that violence has to be controlled, and you do that through discipline, and part of discipline is uniformity, and there's a reason we call it a uniform. It's so that you all look the same. You lose your personality because you don't want to have a personality when you're out there, because there is going to be fear involved. When the bullets start flashing, your instincts are screaming at you to run and hide, but you're looking at your buddies and all of them are standing firm. And that's really what motivates people in combat. It's not, for the flag. I mean, we like to see the Hollywood movies where they're, saying, oh yeah, I'm going to storm this machine gun nest for my country and all that. No, it's because, your buddies are counting on you.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you do it for. You do it, you do it for your team.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you a quick story if you want.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, no, I'll leave that one. Let's. I'll tell you a funny story at the end, just before we sign off. But is there anything else you want to talk about first?
No, I just wanted to say that most Canadians, many Canadians, are very grateful to people like you for your military service. Because
some people actually say that, some people, when, like I went to the Top Gun movie wearing my flying suit, and only one person said anything, and he came up to me later and he said, like, were you really a pilot? I saw your patch. I go, yeah. And he goes, oh, well, thank you for your service. I went, holy cats, and there were probably 200 people in the theater. Nobody mentioned a thing. But yeah, when people do say that, it's very much appreciated. So for all your listeners out there, if you see someone with a uniform or especially on Remembrance Day, wearing medals and that kind of stuff, it's very much appreciated when people come up to you and say thank you for your service. It really hits home.
Speaking of uniformity, the one area where they seem to be uniform in the military right now is in Cold Lake. Unfortunately, the military members, they still have to wear masks everywhere they go.
It's just unbelievable.
As you say, the military, the uniform and everything is designed to project an image of strength and power and integrity and aggressiveness. And here you're wearing something that really signals to everyone that you are afraid. You're afraid of fire.
Well, yeah. So I mean, the military has the ability to strip all of your rights under the charter. So you do not have the right even to life. If they say you have to go and storm that machine gun nest or go 300 miles into enemy territory while they're shooting at you, you have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to trust the people that are making these decisions to make the right decisions, And here's a classic example. You go on trains, you have to wear a mask. Well, Justin Trudeau goes on a train and it's all over the media in his photo op. He's not wearing a mask. Oh, well, that wasn't federally regulated. It was a private railway. Okay. So that means it's safe if it's private, right? So, the hypocrisy of all this kind of stuff is unreal. And I just got back from 2 weeks in Europe, and there were still a few areas, like in Spain, you're supposed to wear masks on public transit, but we got on the bus and everybody pulled them off. Nobody said anything. So, but we get on the airplane at Heathrow to come back to Canada. And they're handing out masks as you get on the airplane, and the flight attendants were policing it. If you weren't eating or drinking, they're pointing at you and saying, you got to wear your mask. And it's like, okay, yeah.
Rules for thee, but not for me, it seems. Anyway.
Yeah, and it's a culture of fear. So if you go down that rabbit hole, I think that's really what it's all about. It's saying you will comply with what we say, otherwise, we're gonna. Mm-hmm. Everything from giving you a fine to locking up your bank account.
Well, Tony, this has been a great pleasure to meet you and to hear about your story, your military story, and also, your legal battles. Obviously, a very courageous person, and it's been a pleasure learning more about you here today. So, thanks very much for being our guest on Gray Matter.
Can I tell you a quick story?
Absolutely, please do.
Oh, okay. So when I was with I did 3 years with the Royal Air Force, flying the Tornado with them, and we were doing combat air patrol over Bosnia. So it was typically in the middle of the night, and we would go out and do air refueling. So they were long missions. We're doing 5-6 hour missions. And one night I land, I think it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm tired and I just want to get to bed. And I get out of the airplane, and the ground crew hadn't attached the ladder properly. So the ladder breaks off as I'm climbing out of this airplane. So I'm falling about 10 feet onto a concrete ramp, and I managed to kick my heels out behind me and cushion the fall, so it wouldn't crack my head open. But it turns out I broke both my heels when I landed. So I'm lying on the ground, feeling very sorry for myself, thinking, oh well, maybe they're just bruised, you know. So I get up and I'm hobbling into the hangar, and they had these feral dogs that lived on the airfield. This was in Italy. So and the dogs were very laid back and lackadaisical. But one of them looked at me and it said, "Hey, there's wounded prey. I'm gonna have that one for my breakfast." So it starts snarling at me and showing its teeth and its tails between its legs, and my sense of humor was at a pretty low level at that point. So I pulled my pistol out and I pointed it at him and I said, one more step and you're dog meat. And I think just from the tone of voice, he backed off. But that was not a fun night.
No. I'm sure you have a lot of stories like that. You're going to have to sit down and write a book, Tony. You're going to have to take the time.
Someday.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks again very much for being with us today on Gray Matter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been my honor to talk to you, and hopefully I'll get up to Cold Lake sometime and see you.
Yeah, I would love to have you over. Thank you.